June, 1945. The island of Okinawa has become a furnace of iron and mud. On the southern tip of the island, amidst the jagged limestone cliffs of Mabuni, the air is thick with the copper scent of blood and the acrid stench of cordite. Rain falls in relentless, lukewarm sheets, turning the volcanic ash into a gray slurry that clings to the skin like a shroud. Underneath a canopy of shattered banyan trees, a small group of men from the 32nd Army huddle in a shallow cave. Their uniforms are little more than rotting rags. Their ribs protrude against skin turned sallow from starvation and malaria. In the distance, the rhythmic, soul-crushing thunder of American naval bombardment, the Typhoon of Steel, pulverizes the landscape, a reminder that the world they knew is being systematically erased. For these soldiers, the end is no longer a question of if, but how. They have been taught that the only honorable exit is through a final, suicidal charge or a self-inflicted grenade blast. To surrender is to cease being Japanese. To be captured is to become a ghost, a creature of eternal shame. This desperate scene was the culmination of one of the bloodiest campaigns in human history. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Army's strategy had shifted from victory to a grueling war of attrition, intended to bleed the American forces so profusely that they would sue for a negotiated peace. On Okinawa, the final bastion before the home islands, the defense was total. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers and thousands of conscripted civilians were pressed into a meat grinder of subterranean warfare. The psychological conditioning of these men was absolute. From childhood, they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda depicting Americans as Kichiku-bei, devilish American and British beasts, who delighted in the torture and mutilation of captives. They believed that to fall into American hands meant being steamrolled by tanks or having their ears and noses harvested as trophies. This fear was a more effective leash than any officer's sword, ensuring that even as their ammunition vanished and their water ran dry, the thought of raising a white flag remained a terrifying impossibility. The emotional weight of this indoctrination created a vacuum of despair. In the minds of the men in the cave, the Americans were not just a military force, they were a supernatural disaster, a mechanical monster fueled by an alien, industrial malice. Every shell that landed was a testament to a power they could not comprehend, yet they were told this power was brittle, lacking the spiritual purity of the Yamato spirit. They expected the Americans to be as cruel as the propaganda suggested, because they were prepared to be just as cruel in return. The contrast between their reality, subsisting on grass and muddy water, and the perceived ferocity of their enemy created a state of hypervigilance. They watched the mouth of the cave with wide, bloodshot eyes, clutching their last remaining Type 97 grenades to their chests. They were waiting for the demons to arrive, certain that the first face they saw through the smoke would be the face of their executioner. They did not realize that the greatest shock they would face was not the violence of the enemy, but a simple, devastating gesture of recognition that would challenge everything they believed about the world. To understand the depth of the shock that awaited these men, one must first dismantle the psychological fortress constructed by the Japanese state over decades. This was the ideology of the demon, a systematic erasure of the individual in favor of a spiritual, nationalistic collective. From the moment a Japanese boy entered primary school, he was taught that the emperor was a living god and that his highest purpose was to die for that god. This was not merely a military duty, it was a religious transcendence. In the trenches of Okinawa, this manifested as a profound, terrifying certainty. The soldiers believed they were fighting a holy war against a soulless, materialistic beast. The United States was depicted in state-controlled media as a nation of predatory monsters who sought to enslave the Japanese race and desecrate their ancestral shrines. This indoctrination was so complete that it bypassed logic, settling into the marrow of their bones as an instinctual dread. By 1945, this propaganda had reached a fever pitch. Leaflets dropped by American planes, promising fair treatment and hot meals, were dismissed as clever traps or evil magic, designed to lure the virtuous into a state of shameful submission. The Japanese High Command reinforced this by spreading rumors of the Bataan Death March in reverse, claiming that Americans routinely executed anyone who surrendered. They spoke of the Great Cleansing, a myth that the Americans intended to exterminate the Japanese population until only the very young remained to be re-educated as slaves. Consequently, the Japanese soldier did not view surrender as a survival tactic. He viewed it as a fate far worse than death. He was trapped between the physical fire of the American front line and the spiritual fire of his own conditioning. To give up was to betray one's ancestors, one's family, and one's very soul. This ideological cage was reinforced by the harsh reality of the battlefield. The soldiers saw the immense material wealth of the United States, the endless stream of trucks, the mountains of supplies, the sheer density of their artillery fire, and interpreted it as proof of a cold, mechanical heart. They believed that a nation with so much steel must have no room for mercy. In their minds, the Americans were demons of metal, soulless entities who used machines to compensate for a lack of spiritual resolve. This created a profound emotional contrast. The Japanese soldier, starving and rotting in a cave, felt a twisted sense of spiritual superiority even as he prepared for his demise. He expected the Americans to be brutal because he could not imagine a power that did not use its strength to crush the weak. This expectation of cruelty was the last thing he had left to hold on to, a final anchor in a world that was rapidly dissolving into chaos and fire. The moment of capture was not a climax of violence, but a heavy, terrifying silence. As the last remnants of the Japanese defense line collapsed, the soldiers emerged from their limestone crypts like ghosts rising from the earth. They stepped into a world that had been scoured clean of vegetation, a moonscape of pulverized rock and black soot. Their hands were raised, but their hearts were braced for the impact of a bullet. For most, the decision to surrender had been driven by a primal, exhausted realization that the body could no longer sustain the spirit's demands. Yet, as they shuffled toward the olive-drab lines of the 7th Infantry Division, they felt they were walking toward their own funeral. Every rustle of a GI's rifle sling, every barked command in a harsh, guttural language, felt like the final gavel of a judge. They expected the Americans to act with the same fanatical cruelty they had been told was the hallmark of the Western beast. This surrender process was a study in profound psychological friction. The Japanese soldiers were searched with a clinical, detached efficiency that they mistook for cold-blooded preparation for slaughter. They saw the GIs, young men, often grimy and hollow-eyed themselves, looking at them not with hatred, but with a mixture of curiosity and pity. This lack of visible rage was deeply unsettling. In the Imperial Japanese Army, a defeated enemy was a subhuman entity, deserving only of contempt or destruction. To be looked at with anything else felt like a bizarre psychological trick. The prisoners were ordered to strip for medical inspections and delousing, a standard military procedure that, to the Japanese mind, felt like the ritualistic stripping of their remaining dignity before an execution. They stood shivering in the humid air, waiting for the first blow, the first bayonet thrust, or the first burst of a machine gun. The terror was palpable, a thick, metallic taste in the back of their throats. They watched the American soldiers smoking, laughing, and casually tossing half-eaten bars of chocolate into the dirt. This display of waste was their first glimpse into the vast, incomprehensible gulf between their two worlds. To a Japanese soldier who had lived on a handful of moldy rice for weeks, the sight of an American soldier discarding food was a sign of a terrifying, decadent power. As they were herded into trucks and transport ships, the prisoners remained huddled together, eyes darting toward any movement. They were convinced that the trucks were taking them to a cliffside for a mass shooting, or that the ships would simply dump them into the Philippine Sea. They were men standing on the threshold of a new reality, still wearing the mental armor of the old one, unable to conceive that the hands reaching out to them were not holding knives, but something far more transformative. As the trucks ground their way toward the rear echelon processing centers, a new sensation began to permeate the consciousness of the captives. It was not a sight or a smell, but a sound, a low, rhythmic, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air of the encampment. This was the sound of the American logistics machine, a persistent thrumming of generators and cooling fans that never seemed to tire. To the Japanese soldiers, whose own supply lines had been severed months ago, leaving them in a world of primitive silence and desperate scavenging, this industrial heartbeat was profoundly alien. It represented a level of organization and energy that defied their understanding of warfare. In the Imperial Army, every resource was squeezed until it bled dry. Here, the Americans seemed to breathe electricity and gasoline as if it were as common as the tropical air. The source of this specific thrumming was often a portable refrigeration unit, a squat, olive-drab box that sat vibrating in the mud. To a man who had not seen a block of ice since his childhood in the northern prefectures, the idea of artificial cold in the middle of a Pacific inferno was a miracle of decadent proportions. As the prisoners stood in ragged lines, they heard another sound, the crisp, musical clinking of glass. It was the sound of crates being unloaded, bottles of Coca-Cola, beer, and milk hitting against one another with a clarity that sliced through the heavy humidity. This sound became a recurring symbol of the impossible American abundance. It was a noise that spoke of a home front so untouched by the ravages of war that it could export the luxuries of childhood and peace to the doorstep of a battlefield. This mechanical symphony created a deep, subconscious fracture in the prisoners' resolve. They had been told the Americans were soft, that their reliance on machines was a sign of spiritual rot. Yet, hearing the effortless power of those generators, the Japanese soldiers felt a growing sense of insignificance. The Yamato spirit had been their shield, but it felt thin and brittle against the relentless humming certainty of American industry. They watched as GIs moved with a casual, almost bored efficiency, fueled by the cold contents of those glass bottles. The sound of that abundance was a constant reminder that they were not just fighting men, but a civilization that had mastered the very elements. It was a sensory prelude to a collapse of ideology. The thrumming of the machines was the sound of a future they had been told could never exist, now vibrating beneath the soles of their boots. The processing at the stockades was a clinical, rhythmic operation that the Japanese captives viewed through a lens of profound paranoia. To the American medical corpsmen, the line of emaciated men was a logistical problem of hygiene and disease prevention. To the prisoners, it was a terrifying gauntlet. They were ordered to strip, standing naked and vulnerable in the humid air, a state that in Japanese military culture represented the absolute nadir of human dignity. When the Americans brought forward the large silver canisters of DDT powder, the prisoners flinched. They had heard rumors of poison gas and chemical skin melting, and as the white dust billowed around them from the hand-pumped nozzles, many closed their eyes and waited for their lungs to sear. Instead, they felt only the cool, chalky grit of the insecticide. The expected agony never came. Instead of death, they were being purged of the lice and mites that had tormented them in the mud of the southern ridges for months. This pattern of expected cruelty followed by inexplicable care repeated with every interaction. When American doctors approached with silver needles, the prisoners braced for lethal injections or human experimentation. Instead, they received vaccinations and vitamins. Bandages were applied to tropical ulcers with a gentleness that was entirely absent from the Imperial Army's own medical system, where the wounded were often expected to take their own lives to save resources. The prisoners watched the GIs move with a casual, efficient stride, their movements soundtracked by the constant low-frequency hum of generators. This sound, which had initially been a source of intimidation, began to feel like a protective barrier, an invisible wall of industrial power that separated them from the madness of the front lines. Every gesture from the captors was a psychological blow. The Americans did not scream. They did not strike the prisoners for failing to bow. they did not perform the ritualized humiliations that were standard in the Japanese disciplinary code. This absence of brutality was more disorienting than violence would have been. The Japanese soldiers found themselves in a state of cognitive dissonance, searching for the demon they had been promised but finding only tired, bored young men in olive drab. They looked at the overflowing trash bins filled with discarded bandages and empty ration tins, symbols of a nation that could afford to throw away more than the Japanese Empire could produce. This display of waste, combined with the clinical precision of their processing, began to strip away the Kichiku-bei myth. They were being treated not as subhuman beasts, but as a biological problem to be solved with science and resources. The ideological cage was cracking, and for the first time, the fear of death was being replaced by a much more complex and terrifying emotion: the realization that everything they had been told about their enemy was a lie. The psychological walls of the prisoners did not collapse under the weight of an American bombardment, but rather under the weight of a meal. At the designated feeding time, the captives were led toward a field kitchen where the air was thick with scents that felt like a sensory assault. To men whose stomachs had shrunk to the size of a fist after weeks of eating palm hearts and raw snails, the smell of baking bread and searing meat was disorienting. They were handed metal mess kits, sturdy, heavy, and clean, and then the American abundance was manifest in physical form. Large, steaming ladles deposited generous portions of white rice, but it was the additions that paralyzed them. Slabs of canned ham, glistening with fat, and golden halves of peaches swimming in heavy syrup were piled high. Finally, each man was handed a carton of chilled milk, the condensation on the cardboard chilling their grime-streaked fingers. This was the feast of the enemy, and to the Japanese soldiers, it was a moment of profound spiritual crisis. In the Imperial Army, food was a weapon of discipline. Officers ate well while enlisted men starved, and a soldier was expected to survive on the spirit of Yamato rather than calories. Here, the rank-and-fold captives were being fed better than the highest-ranking Japanese generals in the field. The white bread, soft and bleached of all grit, was a symbol of a civilization that had conquered the basic struggle for survival. As they began to eat, the silence in the stockade was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical thrumming of the camp generators in the background. The sweetness of the peaches was so intense it brought some of the men to tears, not out of joy, but out of a crushing sense of betrayal. Every bite was a piece of historical evidence that their leaders had lied. They had been told that America was a hollow shell, a nation of decadent cowards who were starving due to U-boat blockades. Yet, here was a feast being served in the middle of a war zone. The sheer volume of the food represented a logistical miracle they could not fathom. If the Americans could afford to give peaches and milk to their hated prisoners, what must they be giving to their own men? The symbolic weight of the abundance became a recurring theme in their internal dialogue. They looked at their own emaciated limbs and then at the overflowing bins of food waste behind the mess tent. The realization was as cold as the milk in their hands. They weren't just losing a war of soldiers, they were losing a war of realities. The silence of the stockade was eventually broken by a presence that felt like a bridge between two worlds. A Nisei interpreter, dressed in the same sharp olive-drab uniform as the guards but possessing the familiar features of their own kin, sat down on a crate among the men. He did not carry a weapon or a whip. He carried only a pack of cigarettes and a calm, steady gaze. As he spoke, his Japanese was fluent, carrying the soft inflections of the home islands that many of these men hadn't heard in years. He didn't mock their defeat or demand military secrets. Instead, he observed them as they finished their unbelievable rations of ham and peaches, the rhythmic, mechanical thrumming of the nearby generators providing a steady pulse to the conversation. The interpreter looked at the group of hollow-eyed soldiers and delivered a sentence that would reverberate through their collective psyche more violently than any artillery barrage. He told them, simply and firmly, "You're not our enemy anymore." In the rigid, binary world of the Imperial Japanese Army, Such a concept was a logical impossibility. To them, the state of enmity was eternal and biological. Once you were an enemy, you remained one until you were dead or your civilization was erased. To be told that the war was over for them individually, that they were no longer targets, but human beings under the protection of a different law, was a psychological earthquake. It stripped away their last defense, the necessity of their own hatred. This revelation was the ultimate manifestation of American ideology over Japanese indoctrination. The interpreter explained that as long as they were in uniform and armed, they were combatants to be neutralized, but now that they were captives, they were guests of the United States. This distinction between the soldier and the man was entirely alien to the prisoners. They had been taught that their very existence was a weapon of the emperor. To be told they were no longer enemies meant they were free to exist outside of the war. They watched the GIs walking past, no longer seeing them as demons, but as men who were simply waiting for the same thing they were, the end of the madness. The symbolic abundance of the camp, the overflowing trash, the humming machines, the white bread, now took on a new meaning. It wasn't just proof of power, it was the foundation of a society that could afford to be merciful. The transformation of their perception was beginning to take root, replacing the fear of execution with a terrifying, beautiful hope. The fracture within the Japanese soul was more agonizing than the wounds sustained in the caves. As the interpreter's words settled, a profound silence descended over the prisoners, broken only by the persistent mechanical thrumming of the American camp's generators. This sound, once a harbinger of industrial doom, now felt like the heartbeat of a reality they were struggling to accept. They were experiencing a total collapse of their moral universe. For years, they had been told that to survive capture was to commit a crime against their bloodline. Yet, here they were, breathing, fed, and told they were no longer enemies. The realization that their government had demanded their deaths while their captors offered them life created a crushing sense of betrayal. They looked at the white bread and the remains of the syrupy peaches, and instead of nourishment, they saw the evidence of a monumental lie. This internal conflict manifested as a physical heaviness. Many of the men sat with their heads bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the Nisei interpreter or the casual American guards. They were grappling with the shame of being treated well. In the warrior code of Bushido, there was no provision for mercy toward the defeated. Therefore, receiving mercy felt like an additional layer of humiliation. They searched for a hidden motive, a secret cruelty that would justify their original hatred. They waited for the Americans to demand information, to force them into labor, or to use them as human shields. But the Americans simply continued their routines, their focus directed toward the horizon and the eventual end of the war. The contrast was stark. The Japanese state viewed them as expendable ammunition, while the Americans viewed them as a logistical obligation to be managed with clinical indifference. The recurring symbol of American abundance, the constant, humming energy and the limitless supplies, became the focal point of their transformation. It was a physical manifestation of a society that did not need to starve its own people to build a military. The prisoners watched the GIs toss away perfectly functional equipment or leave lights burning in empty tents, a level of waste that was sacrilegious to a Japanese soldier. This abundance was the ultimate psychological weapon. It proved that the decadent West was actually a juggernaut of production and stability. As they sat in the shade of the stockade, the ideological cage they had lived in for decades finally dissolved. They were no longer soldiers of a divine emperor. They were broken men who had been saved by the very demons they had been sworn to destroy. The shame began to evolve into a quiet, simmering anger directed toward the leaders who had sent them to die in the mud while hiding the truth of the world. They were witnessing the birth of a new perception, one where the individual mattered more than the collective, and where the end of enmity was the only path back to their own humanity. The internal transformation of the captives was accelerated by a spectacle they had never witnessed within the rigid, caste-like structure of the Imperial Japanese Army. From the perimeter of their barbed wire enclosure, the prisoners watched the daily life of their captors with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning awe. In the Japanese military, the distance between an officer and an enlisted man was an unbridgeable chasm, enforced by ritualized face-slapping and a culture of absolute, silent submission. To fail in a minor task was to invite a physical beating. To speak out of turn was unthinkable. Yet, before them, the American military machine functioned with a casual, almost irreverent fluidity. They saw American privates leaning against trucks, sharing cigarettes with lieutenants, and engaging in animated, laughing conversations that lacked any trace of the terror-driven reverence required by the Emperor's code. This display of democratic interaction was as shocking as the mechanical abundance of the camp. The Japanese soldiers observed American officers standing in the same mess lines as their men, eating the same canned peaches and white bread from the same metal kits. There was no divine aura surrounding the American commanders, no distance maintained through brutality. Instead, there was a sense of shared purpose and individual agency. The prisoners watched as GIs argued, joked, and moved with a relaxed confidence that suggested they were citizens first and soldiers second. This was the living embodiment of the Western beast they had been taught to despise, a society that appeared disorganized and soft on the surface, yet possessed a terrifying, cohesive strength fueled by something other than fear. The constant rhythmic thrumming of the camp's generators served as the heartbeat to this observation, a reminder that this casual democracy was backed by an industrial power beyond their comprehension. To the Japanese mind, the lack of visible discipline should have resulted in chaos, yet the American camp operated with the precision of a Swiss watch. Supplies flowed, orders were carried out, and the wounded were tended to with a clinical efficiency that surpassed anything the Imperial Army could offer. The prisoners began to realize that the Americans did not fight because they were forced to buy a God King, but because they believed in the machine they were a part of. This realization was the final blow to their indoctrination. They saw that a man could be a soldier without losing his identity, and that a nation could be powerful without being cruel. The spirit, they had been told, was their exclusive weapon, was being outmatched by a spirit of a different kind, one rooted in the freedom to speak, to eat, and to coexist. As they sat in the dust, watching a sergeant and a captain share a laugh over a bottle of Coca-Cola, the Japanese prisoners understood that the world they were returning to would have to be entirely different from the one that had sent them to die. The final transition from soldier to survivor was marked by a quiet, poetic realization that transcended the barbed wire of the stockade. As the months passed and the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire drew near, the men who had once huddled in the sulphurous caves of Okinawa found themselves standing on the threshold of a world they no longer recognized, but were beginning to understand. The constant rhythmic thrumming of the American generators remained the heartbeat of their existence, a steady reminder that the industrial and moral power which had defeated them was now the very thing sustaining them. They were no longer the ghosts of a dying ideology. They were witnesses to a new way of being. The shame that had initially threatened to consume them had been replaced by a solemn, reflective gratitude, a realization that their lives had been spared not by a lack of enemy resolve, but by an abundance of enemy humanity. For many of these men, the post-war years would be defined by the memory of those first moments in captivity, the taste of a chilled peach, the softness of white bread, and the steady voice of an interpreter declaring an end to their status as enemies. They returned to a Japan in ruins, but they carried with them a secret knowledge, that the demons they were sent to destroy were, in fact, the architects of a future where survival was not a crime. The symbolic abundance of the American camp became a blueprint for their own reconstruction. They had seen that a nation's strength was not measured by the number of its martyrs, but by the dignity of its citizens and the generosity of its victors. The ideological cage had been shattered by a simple, profound truth, that once the weapons are lowered, the commonality of human hunger and the shared desire for peace are the only things that remain. In the end, The story of the Japanese POWs on Okinawa is not merely an account of military defeat, but a testament to the transformative power of grace. It is a reminder that in the darkest depths of total war, the most potent weapon is not the one that kills, but the one that recognizes the humanity of the opponent. The men who heard the words, "You're not our enemy anymore," were given a gift more precious than any territory or resource. They were given back their futures. They walked out of the stockades and into a new era, carrying the quiet hum of the machines and the sweetness of the peaches in their memories, forever changed by the discovery that even in the aftermath of fire and iron, a hand reached out in friendship can rebuild a world. The truth of freedom was found not in a final charge, but in the simple, quiet act of being allowed to live.